The Galactic Concord hung in a fragile balance, a peace maintained by uneasy truces and whispered threats. But General Xyler of the Krith Dominion had never feared such things. To him, humans were an anomaly, a species far too sentimental, far too weak to truly matter in the grand game of interstellar politics. So when his fleet raised the small border colony on the outskirts of neutral space, he barely gave it a second thought. It was a minor outpost, barely defensible, and strategically insignificant. The resistance had been laughable, a few militia fighters with outdated weapons who barely delayed the inevitable. When the bombardment ceased, the colony was nothing more than smoldering ruins and broken bodies. Xyler's officers reported no surviving human combatants, only a few scattered alien merchants and refugees who had foolishly chosen to make their home among the soft-skinned primates. The general simply ordered the fleet to move on. He had other battles to fight, greater enemies to crush. He never considered the consequences. Across the stars, a distress signal flickered through encrypted channels, bouncing between relays and silent listening posts until it reached a ship traveling in deep space. Aboard the heavily armed freighter Ironclad, Captain Elias Rains leaned forward, watching the final moments of the transmission. The image was shaky, filled with static, but the voice was clear enough. It was not a human voice, but that of an alien, an Elixian merchant, one of the many non-human traders who had settled on the outpost. The merchant's words were rushed, filled with panic as explosions echoed in the background. They came without warning. No negotiations. No mercy. They are killing, the message cut out. A burst of static followed, and then nothing. Rains stared at the blank screen for a long moment, his jaw tightening. Around him, the bridge crew waited, their faces set in grim silence. They had all seen this before, different battles, different wars. The names changed, the flags changed, but the pattern remained the same. Rains inhaled slowly, then exhaled. His voice, when he spoke, was calm. Too calm. Set course for the colony. The crew obeyed without question. The Ironclad and the ships that followed her were no mere freighters. They were wolves in sheep's clothing, vessels modified far beyond what their civilian exteriors suggested. The fleet burned through space, moving without official sanction, without government approval. Humanity did not fight wars over pride. They did not seek conquest. But there were things that demanded action, things that could not be ignored. The destruction of the colony was not just an attack on humans. It was an attack on the people they called friends. And that was something no enemy ever survived. The Ironclad arrived at the ruins of the colony hours later, but there was nothing left to save. What they found instead were wrecked homes, scorched landscapes, and silence. The air was thick with the scent of destruction, and the corpses, human and alien alike, littered the ground in grotesque displays of Krith brutality. Rain stepped out onto the surface, his boots crunching against ash and debris. His gaze swept across the devastation, taking in the details, cataloguing every wound, every sign of suffering. It was not just an execution. It was a message. One of his officers approached, holding a tattered piece of cloth, part of a child's jacket. It was small, frayed at the edges. Rains took it, fingers brushing against the burned fabric. He exhaled slowly, forcing down the wave of cold fury that threatened to rise. Then he turned to his crew. "Transmit a message," he said evenly. "To every ship, every outpost, every station that hears us." His communications officer hesitated. "What message, sir?" Rains lifted his gaze to the darkened sky above, where the Krith fleet had vanished into the void, believing the matter was finished. They had made a mistake. He looked back at his officer, his expression unreadable. His voice was steel.
The Dominion fleet drifted lazily through the darkness of space, their warships forming a massive blockade around the contested sector. General sat within the command throne of the Wrath, satisfied with his latest conquest. The human colony had been nothing more than an inconvenience, another stubborn outpost in the Dominion's inevitable expansion. The humans had always been too sentimental, too soft. They treated their so-called allies as equals rather than subjects, forming pointless bonds with weaker species. Scoffed at the thought. In war, there was only strength, only power. His officers stood at attention, their reptilian forms rigid with discipline. One of them, a junior strategist, stepped forward. "General, we have intercepted a transmission." Waved a claw dismissively. "Another pathetic plea for peace? Ignore it." The officer hesitated. "It is not a plea, sir. It is a declaration. That made pause. He narrowed his eyes. Play it. The flickered to life, displaying the grim face of a human, Captain Elias Rains. His expression was unreadable, his voice calm. Too calm. To the Dominion, Rains began. We know what you've done. You thought there would be no consequences. That no one would come. That no one would care. He paused, his eyes burning with something couldn't quite name. You were wrong. Growled, flexing his claws against the armrests. Bluster. They won't. The transmission continued. We are not diplomats. We are not politicians. We are the ones who are called when lines are crossed, when the cost of violence must be paid in full. Rains leaned forward slightly. And we do not forget. We do not forgive. His next words sent a cold chill through the command deck. You made one mistake. You didn't just attack humans. You attacked our friends. The transmission ended abruptly. The bridge was silent. Officers exchanged uncertain glances, their confident postures faltering. The general sneered. Pathetic threats. What do we know of these humans, besides their weakness? The officer gulped. Sir, there is more. He gestured to another, displaying incoming sensor readings. Gaze snapped to it, his irritation shifting to something colden. A fleet was approaching. A fleet that should not exist. The Dominion had expected a token response, perhaps a few human warships, maybe a desperate plea to the Concord for intervention. What they had not expected was a ghost fleet. The ships approaching were old models, long thought decommissioned, hidden deep in human space. They bore no official markings, no affiliations with the Terran government. And yet, they moved with precision, with purpose. The ironclad led the charge, a vessel modified far beyond its original freighter design. It was flanked by dozens of other warships, mismatched but deadly. Some were retrofitted cargo haulers, others sleek and registered vessels. They did not follow traditional military formations, did not broadcast identification codes. They moved like hunters in the wood. Eyes widened. This was no desperate militia force. This was something else entirely. Something they had never encountered before. Sir, another officer stammered, we are detecting multiple. The first explosion cut through the wood before the sentence could be finished. A Dominion cruiser on the outer perimeter erupted into flame, its shields shattered in an instant. The fleet reacted too slowly. The human ships did not engage in traditional battle formations. They weaved through the Dominion line, striking with ruthless precision. The warships fired in response, their plasma cannons unleashing torrents of energy. But their targets moved like phantoms, dodging, evading, striking only when necessary. The Dominion had expected a response. Instead, they were being dismantled. Claws gripped the armrests tightly. Deploy the heavy units. They cannot possibly. A second explosion rocked the command deck. Alarms blared. More ships vanished from the tactical display. The humans had not come to negotiate. They had not come for a war. They had come to send a message.
The battlefield was no longer a battlefield. It was a graveyard. What had once been a proud Dominion blockade now drifted in the void, reduced to scattered wreckage and burning husks. The Krith fleet, once confident in their superiority, had been torn apart with terrifying efficiency. Fires burned in the oxygen pockets of shattered warships, casting eerie, flickering light over the remains. Bodies floated silently in the debris field, some still clutching their weapons, never having fired a shot. On the bridge of the Vorik's Wrath, General Zyler clutched the command chair with shaking claws. The cold certainty of defeat clawed at his mind. The humans hadn't just beaten them, they had dismantled them. The attack had been surgical, each strike calculated for maximum damage with minimal waste. This wasn't the reckless desperation of an outmatched enemy. This was the work of professionals, of predators. His second-in-command, Captain Vorik, stood rigid at the control panel, his mandibles clicking nervously. General, our reinforcements are still hours away. We must retreat before. Before what? Zyler thought bitterly. Before they decide to finish us? The Dominion never retreated. Their warriors were bred for conquest, for absolute dominance. But this was different. His forces hadn't even been given the chance to fight properly. They had been hunted. A cold, emotionless voice crackled through the remains of the ship's communication array. Vorik's wrath, this is Captain Elias Rains. Do you copy? The voice alone made Xyler's blood freeze. He had underestimated these creatures. He had thought them soft, weak, bound by sentimental notions of friendship and loyalty. But now, listening to that voice, he realized the truth. Humanity's strength didn't come from their technology or their numbers. It came from their fury. They had not come for revenge. They had come for justice. And there was no force in the galaxy that could stop them when they believed their cause was righteous. Xyler hesitated before responding. His claws tightened around the armrests. This is General Xyler of the Krith Dominion. He forced his voice to remain steady, to retain whatever dignity he could. What do you want, human? A long silence stretched across the comms. Then Rain's voice came through, slow and deliberate. You already know what we want. Xyler's mandibles twitched in frustration. This was a strategic operation. Your colony was in a contested sector. If you had not intervened. You attacked our allies, Rains interrupted. His voice did not rise, but there was something in it, something that sent a shiver down Xyler's spine. You thought no one would care. You thought it wouldn't matter. The human paused, letting the words sink in. Then, in a voice like iron, he said, It matters. A deep, terrible silence settled over the bridge. Xyler could feel his officers watching him, waiting for his response. The Krith had never known fear, never cowered before an enemy. But now, standing on the brink of total annihilation, he knew what it was like to face a force that would not be bargained with. That would not be reasoned with. We surrender, Xyler said finally, the words like acid on his tongue. Another long pause. Then a quiet chuckle. It was not amused. It was not kind. Good, Rain said. Then listen carefully. The holoscreens flickered, displaying the surviving Dominion ships that remained. Their weapons were disabled, their engines flickering with damage, but still functional. You're going to leave this system, Rains continued. You're going to tell your people what happened here. And you're going to remember. Xyler felt a moment of cautious hope. Perhaps they would survive this after all. But then Rains spoke again, and the hope died in his chest. You will never touch our allies again. Not with a fleet, not with a single soldier. If you do, we will not stop at your ships. The human's voice dropped to something cold and final. We will come for your homeworld. A collective shudder ran through the bridge. Even Vorik, hardened by decades of battle, looked stricken. The Krith had spent centuries conquering, expanding, taking what they pleased. Never once had they considered the possibility that someone might come for them. Rain's voice was calm, but the weight of the unspoken promise behind it was clear. This was not a warning. It was a guarantee. Xyler swallowed his pride. We understand. Good. The transmission cut out. No further threats. No demands for tribute. The human fleet remained motionless, watching. Xyler exhaled slowly and turned to his officers. Set course for home, he ordered. His voice was steady, but inside he was reeling. The Krith Dominion would recover from this loss. But they would never forget it. And they would never, ever cross humanity again.
The battered remains of the Krith Dominion fleet limped back to their homeworld, their warships scarred and silent. The journey was long, filled with an oppressive quiet as the surviving officers avoided each other's gaze. General Xyler sat in his quarters, staring at the holographic reports scrolling before him. Tactical assessments, casualty lists, ship losses. It was a litany of defeat, a crushing reminder of the disaster they had barely escaped. The fleet had been decimated, not by overwhelming numbers or superior firepower, but by precision, strategy, and something far more terrifying, human resolve. Xyler clenched his claws against the table, his mandibles clicking in frustration. He had studied humanity before the campaign, seen them as creatures of emotion, prone to sentimentality and weakness. He had been wrong. The humans had not fought for land or resources. They had not fought for honor or glory. They had fought for their friends. And in doing so, they had shown the Dominion what true power looked like. A chime echoed through the room, and a voice crackled over the intercom. General, we have entered home system space. The High Command demands an immediate report. Xyler exhaled slowly and stood. Prepare the transmission. Minutes later, he stood before the High Council of the Krith Dominion, their massive holographic forms looming over him. The chamber was silent, their expressions unreadable, their multifaceted eyes watching him with unwavering intensity. "General Xyler," the Supreme Chancellor hissed, his voice sharp and accusing. "You were tasked with securing our expansion into the contested sector. Yet, you return in defeat." Xyler straightened, his claws tightening at his sides. The humans intervened. One of the council members scoffed. "Humans? A minor species? You expect us to believe they inflicted such losses?" Xyler's jaw clenched, but he forced himself to remain calm. "They are not what we thought they were." His mandibles twitched as he chose his next words carefully. "They do not fight for conquest. They do not fight for dominance. But when they do fight, they do not stop." The Supreme Chancellor leaned forward. "Explain." Xyler exhaled sharply. "They fought not out of obligation, but out of loyalty. They made no demands, sought no spoils. Their only goal was to protect those they considered their own. And in doing so, they dismantled us. They did not seek battle, they ended it before it began. Their tactics were not reckless charges or overwhelming firepower, but precision. Every strike was calculated, every attack deliberate. They did not fight us head-on. They hunted us." A murmur spread through the council. The Krith had spent centuries as the galaxy's apex predators. To hear that another species had turned the tables on them was almost unthinkable. One of the elder warlords narrowed his eyes. "And you surrendered?" Xyler hesitated, his pride warring with his survival instincts. "I did what was necessary to ensure our people's survival." The silence that followed was suffocating. Then, the Supreme Chancellor spoke, his voice low and dangerous. "Do you know what you have done, General? You have shown weakness." Xyler's mandibles twitched. "I have shown wisdom." The chamber erupted into arguments. Some saw his actions as cowardice, others as prudence. Xyler remained still, knowing that nothing he said would change the fact that they did not understand. They had not seen what he had seen. Finally, the Supreme Chancellor raised a clawed hand, silencing the chamber. His multifaceted eyes locked onto Xyler. "If what you say is true, then humanity is a threat." Xyler shook his head. "No. They are not a threat unless we make them one." The council exchanged wary glances. Xyler took a step forward, his voice firm. "The humans do not seek war. They do not seek expansion. But if provoked, they will not hesitate. We have two choices: we leave them be, or we fight them again." The room was deathly silent. "And if we fight them again," Xyler said, his voice cold, "we will not survive." The Supreme Chancellor stared at him for a long moment before finally speaking. "You bring troubling news, General. We will deliberate." The transmission cut, and Xyler was left alone in the dim chamber. He exhaled slowly, his claws tightening. He had told them the truth. Whether they would listen was another matter entirely. As he turned to leave, he couldn't shake the feeling that the Dominion had already sealed its fate. If they ignored his warning, if they chose to provoke humanity again, then they would learn the truth the hard way. Because there was one lesson the Krith had learned too late. You never hurt a human's friends and expect to survive.